Thanks, everybody. This is my single directory components workflow, which could be your single directory components workflow, or not. Either way. Happy to be here at Florida Drupal Camp. There is a bit.ly link here to the slides, and I'll also post some other links and resources and stuff that you can check out later. But let's dive in. I am Brian Perry. This is a picture of me doing karaoke in Barcelona. You might be asking, am I drunk in that photo? And to that I say, no, you're the one who's drunk. My website is brianperry.dev. I've been involved in Drupal for quite a long time, over like 12 years at this point. Focused on front-end things, really excited about some of the things going on in front-end Drupal right now. Also have been really interested in JavaScript frameworks and how they can work with headless CMSs like Drupal. I also love Nintendo stuff. I'm kind of in a little bit of a, I usually share what I'm playing, but I'm kind of in a bit of a waiting period for the Switch 2. I am trying to finish up Pikmin 4, though, which has been pretty fun. That's me. This is the slide where usually I say where I work and thank my employer, but I got laid off 9 days ago. Not that I'm counting. Yeah, it's tough out there. However, I just got to say it's been really great so far. Just all the help that I've gotten from the community, and it being involved in an open source community like this is such a wonderful resource during a situation like this. So, but that goes to say I'm looking for full-time work. So if you are looking for someone like me, we should talk.
We're moving to a bigger room.
We're moving to a bigger room.
Well, I'm not standing over here. Are you going to use that chair?
No, you can take this.
I'm taking that chair. Captain's chair.
I thought you were serious.
I am serious. Bullshit.
Okay, so we are not moving to a bigger room, but we're gonna make do. We should just take over the auditorium. Anyway, moving on to single directory components and single directory component things. As I mentioned, I do enjoy JavaScript frameworks like React. I also like Astro quite a bit, but there are definitely situations where they are overkill. Just in the we can't necessarily solve all problems with our Drupal-shaped hammer. There are cases where there are projects where they would be overkill. So somewhat recently, I found myself working on a pretty straightforward Drupal theme. And that was a situation where there really wasn't a need for a heavy framework like React or anything. And it also proved to be a good opportunity for me to start working in a more actual real project way with single directory components. It was my first legit Drupal theme that I'd done, I think, in about 3 years. So it was really exciting to actually put single directory components through its paces and see if it would work out for me. Which, in general, is what we'll be talking about today, my experience with that. So, I did have some questions going into it beyond even just will this be a nice developer experience for me? But how has Drupal theming changed in general? I certainly keep up with Drupal, but hadn't really built a traditional Drupal theme in quite a while. Will modern web standards and some of the things that changed in the web platform in general since I built a Drupal theme, will that make my life easier? I hoped so. And will I miss my fancy flashy frameworks and my Reacts and all that stuff? And then also, will single directory components solve all of my problems? No, they will not. But they'll do some great things. So, do want to just cover at a high level a little bit what single directory components are. Who is not familiar with single directory components? Okay, excellent, cool. Well, yeah, we'll cover the basics as well. They're also often called SDCs. Makes sense, the abbreviation there. But so what are they? There's a couple different ways that you can think of what a single directory component is. I think the most important thing is actually that it's now Drupal core's component primitive. Drupal core now actually has the concept of a component, a front-end component, which is great. There were a lot of ways that people built with components in Drupal, but they were all, there were common practices and things like that, but there was no official way to do it in Drupal. And now there is, and that's cool. And that also allows things like a contrib ecosystem to spring up around this solution, and things like experience builders to be built with a lot of these primitives as well. And then there's also the single directory-ness of it all. So a single directory components are single directory components because they are in a single directory. And yeah, I'm blowing minds here. And the things that can be in that single directory, at least that the SDC will pick up on, is a YAML file. There has to be a YAML file. It can be really basic, but the component doesn't exist unless there's a YAML file. A Twig template. I think that is technically required, but if you don't have a Twig template, you're not rendering anything anyway. And then optionally, you can have CSS and JavaScript assets. And those will be automatically loaded as libraries. So you previously would have to define the library yourself, and the SDC will take care of that for you. And basically an SDC, the directory and all the files will essentially have the same machine name. We'll be building a card component, so all the files will be card.something. And then beyond that, they also simplify using components in Drupal, in my opinion, in a few ways. And as I understand it, that was actually one of the intents of the way this was designed. I already touched on the fact that now there is a standard for this. So that simplifies things in that there is a well-worn path to how you do this now. All of your files are in one place. I'm sure many people in this room have had the joy of trying to find where a template is in a Drupal theme. That can be a lot harder than one would assume. But now you know, they're in that single directory. It loads the libraries automatically, which is awesome. And they cannot be, the components themselves cannot be pre-processed. So you essentially, once you get to your component, you won't have to be searching for hooks and pre-process and things like that, which has pluses and minuses, right? It takes away some of the wild things that you could do, but you, again, are not going to have to search far and wide through your Drupal code base to find out where things are actually happening. And then, again, it allows things to be built on top of this primitive, which is going to be very cool for the future. So now we will get into the workflow that I found myself using when using single directory components when building a theme. And a quick little distinction or aside here in that most of the things that I'll talk about are general single directory component things. But there are also a few things in my workflow that I'm going to cover that are just Brian things that I thought worked well here. And I'll call that out when we get to them. In fact, I may be doing that almost immediately. But and then for this example, so for a variety of reasons, including the fact that I was just laid off from the company that I built this theme for, we'll be using a new example rather than the site that I built. But
we're going to source it.
Yeah, yes. But what we're going to do is, so this is the cards that show up when you do Drupal CMS install. There is a contrib Olivero Drupal CMS theme that has these cards. And the kind of pretend brief here is that we're going to spice up those cards. Not to say that these aren't nice looking cards, but we're going to change their look and feel relatively substantially. So we're going to start by stepping through prototyping, which probably falls into the category of a Brian thing, but we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so first we're going to do some prototyping of what the component would look like before we start thinking about the Drupal of it all. And for this example, I used some AI tools to actually build the card component and the styles itself. I used bolt.new, which is pretty cool. Can go a long way as far as building simple components, even like pretty full JavaScript applications. When using something like that for this, I found that there are a few things that you got to be really specific with when you're prompting here. The biggest one is that the first thing that I told it is that I wanted to only use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's not because other things are bad necessarily, but if you don't tell it that, it's definitely going to give you Tailwind and React most of the time. So I asked it to stick to the things that we can easily dump into a single directory component. I also asked it to give it a retro style, and then I asked it to use Drupal's brand colors. And I tried to upload Drupal's brand guidelines, and it's like, it replied like, I can't look at this document, but I know what Drupal's brand colors are. It's like, okay, that's cool. That's cool. And I also asked it to add a JavaScript-based interaction, which is probably overkill for this component, but allows us to also look at the JavaScript piece of single directory components. So yeah, I had it make this style of a card, and now, yeah, onto a Brian thing that is definitely not required for using single directory components, but is the workflow that I like to use when it makes sense, is to do some prototyping outside of Drupal to start. There's a variety of reasons for that. One is that I often find myself in a situation where I'm getting started ahead of the actual functionality existing on the Drupal side. So it makes it a lot easier to get ahead of building some of these components before the functionality exists. And also, as we'll see, I think it really, doing it this way for this example also really helps kind of illustrate some of the generic concepts for single directory components and how I think they actually do a pretty good job at mapping to what people consider components more broadly in front-end development these days. I use Astro for this, partially just because I like Astro, but I find it's a place that I can iterate really quickly, and it's basically just, at its simplest, it can be just HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So almost all stuff that we can just dump right into Drupal. All right, so going through the process of prototyping and building these components. So first, if you do have some libraries that you know you're going to be using, you're going to want it to be part of your prototype. In this case, the thing that I actually needed as a library was basically Olivero's styles, or technically that Olivero Drupal CMS theme. So I actually just borrowed their base styles and dumped them in this prototype so that the thing that I'm creating in my prototype is going to be exactly what it looks like when I use it in Drupal. A couple of tools that I've also used for this sort of thing recently that I like. One is a really lightweight CSS framework called Pico that really just focuses on like semantic HTML elements, provides a nice base. And then another library I like is OpenProps, which is basically just a set of CSS variables for things like colors and spacing and things like that. Kind of like the design tokens in Tailwind without all of the Tailwindness of it. But a lot of people also would use Tailwind for something like this. All right, so first thing, add some basic markup to get the structure of the card that we're trying to build. So again, I had AI do this for me, but the structure of the card, pretty simple and straightforward here. You can get it kind of stood up and look at the pieces of data that you're including in your component, and then move on to things like styling. But yeah, nothing all that complicated about the markup here, with one exception. So there's that retro card custom element. And that is another Brian thing, a thing that I enjoy doing. You certainly do, this is not a thing that you have to do with single directory components, but it worked nice in my workflow. So a custom element with a dash is actually valid HTML. You can actually upgrade that, and we'll talk about this in a bit. You can make it a web platform web component, but a custom tag like that is just completely valid HTML. So you can use that in your markup, and then it makes things like scoping your CSS really easy, because the beginning of your selector will be that retro card, in this case custom element, and then everything is scoped to this component. So if that's desirable for you, it's kind of nice.
Ryan, are you registering your tag?
I will register my tag, so okay. we'll get to that. But basically the idea here is that you can start out with the element, and then if you do want to add interactivity or something that a web component would do, then you register the tag. But you don't have to.
Okay.
Good question. So we now have the basic shell of this component. And kind of what I do next at this point is actually try to get data into it, rather than things that are hard-coded. So outside of Drupal, and also now with single directory components inside of Drupal, there are two things that are going to be part of this process potentially: props and slots. So if you are familiar with using components in something like React, that concept exists there. It also exists now in single directory components. They're the same thing, which is great. But if you're not familiar with props or slots, the simplest high-level distinction between them, in my opinion, is that slots are for unstructured data, like markup, generally. Or they could be other components, which themselves will be markup. And then props are more like key-value pairs. In the JavaScript frameworks, they can be more complicated things like objects. But at least from the Drupal side, you can generally think of them as key-value pairs or like attributes on an HTML element. So you will find yourself, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through, but asking yourself, should this be a prop or should this be a slot? But yeah, again, if it's markup, I would say start with thinking of it as a slot, and if it is not unstructured data, then start with it as a prop. But you can always change. Cool. So yeah, this is again the markup, and the slots. This is Astro's convention here. Is a slot tag, and it has a name. So that is where we're going to put the markup for the image. And generally, for something like an image, I try to keep that slot pretty high level. And the advantage when working with it in Drupal is that you can let Drupal do what it does with images. You don't have to pick out the individual URLs or construct a picture element yourself unless you want to. You can if you want to. But Drupal's actually pretty good at that. So it can really make your life a lot easier if you just let Drupal put that image in that slot. So yeah, there's a couple other slots, and then the props here are these things in curly braces, which are essentially just variables that we're using. Date tag, title, URL. The AI went really hard with the call to action button link, jack in, but I went with it. And then, so this is kind of another view of the props, but this is in just an index page that is using the component. So there's the card element here, but the props are things that are passed in as essentially attributes. In this example, they're all strings, but they could be other formats. Drupal's SDCs, when we start looking at the schema, it uses JSON schema format. So it isn't necessarily just strings, but in this example, it's just strings. And then also you'll see that the slots themselves is the markup that we want to pass in with the slot name. And both of those things we'll see actually map pretty well to Drupal and single directory components.
Just so I know, this is probably the file for Astro to be able to slip in example content for your prototype, right?
Yep. Yeah, I probably should have had the file names here, but this technically is just index.astro, which is Astro's component syntax. That's actually worth clarifying, and we'll get into some examples that show it a little bit better. But the simplest version of an Astro file could just be markup, just regular HTML. You can also, in the metadata up top, you can write JavaScript. So this section is JavaScript, and that we're getting a little deeper than we need to in Astro, but the stuff that's up here ends up getting server rendered. So you can do things like import node packages. And then as you'll see in a bit, you can also include JavaScript just in a script tag and CSS in a style tag, which we will do in a second. Also, another kind of representation of the props here that you may also see in other JavaScript frameworks. This is a TypeScript interface, and that defines, it's close to defining the schema for the props. And again, they're just strings, so this is like the world's most boring interface, but it is what it is, and it does validate those types. And we'll see in Drupal the different ways that we can validate the schema.
They're not the same order.
So that is the order. It probably would have been cleaner if I had them in the same order, but that's JavaScript object destructuring, so it doesn't matter the order.
Yeah.
It just will give you variables based on those properties. Okay, so moving on to styles. So at this point we actually have the structure of the component. We're passing some data into it, and we now layer on the styles. Again, I had AI come up with the styles here. In Astro, it's just a style tag, so it should be pretty portable. And then the other thing that was mentioned as kind of a me thing is that I'm scoping everything to the custom element. So basically, it's technically using CSS nesting, which is a thing that you can do now, finally, but nests everything in that retro card selector. And now this is what the component ends up looking like, now that we've styled it. And then, again, this is probably slight overkill for this component, but I did want to have some JavaScript. And what it did for me, because it was retro styled, is if you click on the image or if you click on the little tag chip, it does like a flicker, which is what you see here in the GIF. And the code for that is pretty simple. It's just selecting the element and then adding a class. Really, really simple stuff, but technically an example of some JavaScript interactivity. And then this gets back to your question from before. So now that we do have some JavaScript, it actually does make sense to upgrade this to actually be a web component and register it, which is pretty small down here. Sorry about that, but it's just custom elements.define. And I basically just took the code that AI spit out and just put it in a HTML element class, and most of the work here is in the connected callback function that happens when the component gets mounted. So why would you do this? There's a few reasons. One, again, is the scoping of it. a great thing about web components in like the web standard version of web components is that all of this code is going to be isolated to this instance of the component. You can reach out into the DOM if you want, but if you target this inside of this component, it's that instance of the component. Yes?
Does that mean that the CSS rules do not go into the slots?
So the CSS, the way that we've done it so far, is global CSS. So because this is probably due to like some things that you know about web components and like the shadow DOM and stuff. Okay. Yeah. There you go. We won't even get into that. But the CSS here is global, intentionally global. It's not actually like scoped to the component. It's just using that selector.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay. Cool. But yeah, so it makes it a lot easier to just act on this instance of the component instead of having to like look at the DOM, find the cards, iterate through your cards, add on clicks to each of the cards, stuff that you may have done before in Drupal themes. And also, this is just a small progressive enhancement rather than the big hammer of making the entire component JavaScript. If you have JavaScript disabled, it's still going to render the card like we saw. The only thing that you won't get is the little click flicker interaction. So yeah, great for progressive enhancement. So that was building it out in our prototyping tool of choice. So now let's just go through the process of integrating it into Drupal. And it should feel pretty similar to what we talked through, which I think is a great thing. I was impressed and surprised at how well single directory component concepts do map to more generalized front-end component concepts. So first thing, you need to create a single directory for your single directory component. And it would be in a components subdirectory of either a module or theme. So we created a card directory. And then you have to create your YAML file. So it's a card, so in this case, card.component.yaml. And the bare minimum of that, it has to have a name and then an empty props object. It's kind of annoying that you have to do that, but you do. So this is that's the absolute bare minimum there to make the component exist. And we'll go back and fill in some of the pieces of that. And then also create a Twig template. So card.twig, it's not card.twig.html, which is the file extension that you have to use for Twig templates in themes.
HTML.twig.
HTML.twig, yes, thank you. You're all on top of everything order related today. And then, again, just kind of standing up the most basic representation of this component. So that's what's in the Twig template, just that retro card element, and it says card component. And at that point, also added card.css file with one super simple rule, just so we could see that the CSS was getting loaded. And we'll layer on the fancy stuff along the way. And so at this point, the component exists. Drupal is aware of the component. But to use it, you need to include it in a Twig template somewhere. So in the Drupal CMS Olivero theme, I actually spun up with the starter kit a copy of it, essentially. So my own custom version of the Drupal CMS Olivero theme. There's a node card template that renders the cards. So just in that file is where you will have to reference your single directory component. And it just uses Twig things that already existed in Drupal. You can either use a Twig include or a Twig embed. If you are going to be using props and, if you're going to be using slots, it needs to be an embed, because we'll see in a bit that it uses Twig blocks. So I tend to just default to using embed regardless. But embed and then you have to reference it with the theme or module machine name, a colon, and then the machine name of the component. So Drupal CMS Olivero SDC card in this case.
Can you go back to step 4?
Yes, although it's now out of order, so we got to check with him. So this was just dropping in a CSS file.
Can we look at step 3?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Here we'll go all the way. Recap. You create your directory, and it needs to be inside of a components subdirectory in a module or theme. You have to create your component.yaml file, and this is the smallest possible version of it. You would create a Twig template, and this is all in that same directory. They all have the same card.something. A CSS file. Optionally, you could also put a JavaScript file in there. We will eventually. And then in a traditional Twig template in your theme, you need to include or embed the single directory component.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So outside of the YAML file and the Twig file, you basically got a web component.
Yes. Yep. And it can be that. It could just be markup. So yeah, at that point now we have a mostly useless component, but it does in fact exist, and it just says card component in place of all of the cards from before. So now, similar to like what we did in the prototype, let's actually start populating things. So we'll start with the slots, and we had already, in doing the prototyping, we got a feel for what we thought were props versus slots, but I think just the two were essentially the body markup of the card and then the image. So this example is the body. In the prototype, it was this slot element. So the Drupal equivalent, first, we need to add the slot to the YAML file to define it. So this is the YAML structure for that. Slots are, because they're unstructured, a little bit more basic than what we'll see for props. But you got to give it a machine name, a title. You can give it a description. And then we define that slot as a block in our Twig template. So this is the same Twig block thing that was before SDCs, but that's just the convention for slots. So it's the block tag and the name body. And then we need to populate that block in our Twig embed that we looked at before. So block body, and then end block in the embed, and what's inside of that can be whatever you want. It could be your own custom markup. In this case, we're actually rendering what essentially is the body field in this case. So it could be another field. It could be something like this. But the unstructured markup that you want. And that's that. So for this component, we did that twice. There's one for the body, and there's one for the image. And it's literally just, especially for the image, just taking everything that Drupal would spit out for that image and just placing it in that spot that we want it. And we're not messing with it too much. So props. This isn't even out of order. That's just the wrong word. I'll fix that. So for props, this is what props, a couple different views of what props look like in our prototype. So the props or attributes that are getting passed to the card here. So for Drupal, again, we need to first put that representation of that in the YAML file. So this is JSON schema, essentially, even though it's in YAML. That's the format that it uses. So it's a little bit more complicated. There's different types, like strings, integers, objects, etc. But yeah, so for the date in this case, type a string, give it a title, give it a description. That's enough for the SDC to be able to pick up on the prop. And now that we've defined it in the YAML file, we can use it. So in the card template itself, it just becomes a Twig variable that we can use, the date variable there. And then we also need to pass it along in our Twig embed. So it is the with portion of the embed. So with, and then an object of the name value pair. So date is what we define the prop at, and in this case, the variable in the Twig template is date. So it's just date. But it could be, I don't know. Start date, yeah, or tag, content.tag, whatever the variable is what you would pass there. And similar to TypeScript, you can also, by defining this schema, you can also enforce it as well. And I think the rule is that the schema, you have to define a schema if it's in a module, and you don't have to define a schema if it's in a theme. I think there's a lot of value in defining this schema regardless, so I tend to always do it, but you don't have to. And then you can include this enforce prop schemas in your YAML file, and that will actually validate what's being passed in against the schema, which can be helpful.
Is there still astronaut prompts?
So this, and I could probably clarify that a little bit better. This was just looking back to what we did in the prototype component, and this is the thing that is in the YAML file.
Not a comment so much as a warning. As soon as you turn on enforce prop schemas, if you violate it, you're going to throw a PHP fatal error on render.
Yes.
So beware. I filed a core bug like that and got shouted down. That drives me insane. Because I'll leave that for later discussion.
Yeah. It certainly could be friendlier, for sure. But
good, just make a single directory component breadcrumb, and good luck to you, sir. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, that good word of warning there. Good word of warning. Yeah, I've experienced that myself as well.
Yeah.
They're the only remaining piece at this point. So we've defined some props and slots. We create our CSS file and have been kind of filling that out along the way. There's the JavaScript interactivity is the piece that remains. And for this particular example, the cool thing is that there's literally nothing that had to change. We just took the exact same JavaScript, the retro card that extends an HTML element, and just put it in our card.js file. It could be that JavaScript can be whatever you want. You can use Drupal behaviors in it, but you can also not. So, again, all this does is just add that progressive enhancement for the little click effect, and I think it's awesome that it doesn't have to be changed in any way for Drupal unless we want to. And this is what we ended up with. So we have our, retro-looking, flickering cards now in the Drupal CMS theme.
Wait, go back to it. I'm recording it.
Excellent.
That's so cool.
Don't use it.
Cool.
Thanks, man.
I mean, hey, anybody who wants to record any of these for posterity, go for it. So we walked through a lot of steps. That is my workflow. I really like to essentially start from the simplest representation of a thing and slowly build out the pieces. That's what I do. That might be too slow for people, especially if we're talking about scaffolding the single directory component in Drupal. And if that's too slow for you, you can use just generate. There's an SDC option, and it will ask you, do you want JavaScript? Do you want CSS? What props do you want? What slots do you want? And it'll just scaffold the whole thing out for you. It's awesome. Also, so we talked a little bit about the powers and potential challenges with schemas, but it really does open up a lot of interesting possibilities. And one, in just messing around with this example, I had AI spit out a few different variations of the card. If you have now clearly defined schema and components that conform to that schema, it kind of gives you superpowers here. So if we wanted to go with a classier, rounded version of the card, and we had 2 SDCs defined that have the exact same schema, exact same props and slots, the only thing that we would need to do to get it to render in that style is just change the reference to the single directory component in our embed. That's it.
Without the Twig part.
What was that?
Without the Twig part.
Oh yeah, this is a simplified example. Like this is basically just the diff of what would need to change. All that same stuff would have to be there as far as what you're passing into it, but yeah, if you wanted to swap between the two, it could be as simple as that. You may or may not also have been asking along the way, like, what about your build process? Which is a good question. If you've either worked with Drupal themes or are familiar with working in the JavaScript frameworks, it's kind of a side effect with this workflow and what I was trying to do in building a pretty simple Drupal theme. But what we walked through actually doesn't require a build step at all. You can use one, but it's just regular CSS. It's JavaScript that is not compiled in any way. And the libraries automatically get added because they're part of the single directory component. So I actually didn't have to have any build process for this. For the full theme that I built, there was no build step. It's partly because it's a pretty simple theme and some of the choices that I made along the way, but you may not need a complex build process. But there's nothing stopping you from doing that if you wanted to use Sass or have NPM dependencies or things like that.
Right. So just to clarify that point, if you wanted for some reason to write Sass in your component, you just have your Sass compiler point to that, and it will compile it down to CSS and be included. Same thing true if you're doing like ES6 for some reason.
Yes.
So you can do it, you're just not required to do it.
Exactly. That's good clarification. And also that means that from the SDC perspective, you have to somehow get to the point where you have a regular CSS file and a regular JavaScript file that is referenced in your single directory component. And Drupal doesn't care how you get there. Excellent. We have just a couple more minutes. So some indispensable contrib tools, in my humble opinion. One is the no markup module. There have been a bunch of different variations on this in the past in contrib, but this is a really great implementation of it. And it just gives you a formatting option to remove all of the field markup. So if you have props like the date, for example, what I wanted was not 17 divs with a date inside of it. I just wanted the date. So with the no markup module, you can flip that on to remove the field markup, and it makes it a little bit easier to work with the props, for example. So super duper useful. There's also Twig tweak. We had some pretty, again, they were pretty simple examples, and I also find that the no markup module often gets me a lot of the way there. But if you are mapping more complicated data or dealing with links, or for some reason you need to get to individual attributes of an image, like an alt tag or something like that, you can dig through the render array. Or something like Twig tweak, if you've used it or not used it before, gives a lot of really nice helpers to getting at some of the pieces of a render array in your Twig template. Others that are helpful, there's an SDC style guide module. So it gives you a style guide that displays your single directory components. That's in active development. There's an SDC block module that will automatically create blocks based on your single directory components. And again, that's the power of having that defined schema, because it can just generate a form for you, generate a block for you. And there's a couple of projects in the contrib ecosystem that have gotten pretty far along in using single directory components. The Radix theme, which has a ton of single directory components in it, and the UI patterns module, the 2.x version of that is also using single directory components. So cool implementations. And especially if you want to see more complicated components, just like opening up the source for the Radix theme and digging around would be a good way to go. All right, just about out of time. A few gotchas. So we kind of talked about it a little bit when we were talking about props versus slots and what might be a prop versus what might be a slot. But from working with single directory components and also previous iterations of using components in Drupal, the general guideline that I have is that if you find yourself like digging deep into a render array to get things like a link or an image URL, you might want to ask yourself why you're doing that and if you have to. But with that concept of slots, you can often save yourself a lot of headaches if you can work with the markup that Drupal wants to give you for something like an image. So if you can just drop that in a slot, your life will be a lot easier. But does it meet your needs? That's the question you have to figure out for yourself. We did talk about the build process piece of this. If you do have a more complicated build process, if you need to compile your Sass or JavaScript or things like that, you do have to set things up so that it's creating the individual assets in your SDCs. So that can be a little bit of work. And we didn't get too deep into it, but that concept of mapping data in a Twig embed can still be pretty tricky when you need to either find the right variable or dig deeper into an object in a render array. And this is more of a me thing, but because we used a custom element for the JavaScript piece of this, because we wrap the component in a custom element, it's actually hard to use custom elements in CK Editor because of text formats. It doesn't allow it. So that's something to be mindful of if that's important to what you're doing. There is a module, embedded content. I actually haven't had a chance to play around with it, but it seems like it could actually solve the problem there and allow you to work around that and embed a custom element in CK Editor. So worth looking at. Yeah, we are pretty much, I'm over time, so I'll basically stop, but this was just covering some dreams for the future. The big piece that I know is coming, be it with Experience Builder or some other contrib tool, being able to do the mapping in Drupal's UI instead of having to do everything in the Twig template like that will be a nice next step for SDCs. We'll definitely get there. I think technically the 2.0 version of UI patterns can do that for you now. Yeah, also just the way Experience Builder is building on SDCs is going to be really interesting for single directory components. And I'll save this stuff because I'm out of time, but if you want me to go on about weird Franken framework stuff, talk to me later. And that's it. I'm basically out of time, but we can probably sneak in some questions or continue the conversation elsewhere. But thanks.
Okay, this is unsolicited advice, but now that you have a lot of time on your hands, you can write a 120-page book about how to build an SDC. And
Awesome.
1995.
You referenced AI a lot, so a lot of this stuff was done using AI.
Yeah, so what I used AI for this was just to create the initial version of the card. So I didn't write any of the markup or styles or JavaScript myself. I tweaked, but I just said, make me a card that has a retro style, and it did. But then beyond that, plugging everything into Drupal, AI did it. Yep.
Well, did you try V0 per se or anything like that, or?
I did the last one.
Yeah, they're going to talk about it tomorrow. I've used V0 a little bit. I think somebody else had their hand up.
That was me.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good job. What can you tell us about islands?
Yeah, it's probably more of a conversation that we'll have to continue later, but Experience Builder is using that concept, which I think is really cool.
Question back here, boss.
Yes.
So, SDCs, Storybook, the Astro tool that you use. I was wondering, like, if you've got an external design system that you're working on.
Yep.
External to Drupal.
Yep.
Probably something useful for React projects and Drupal projects, let's say.
Yep.
Organization, right? How do you get those into and used as SDCs?
Yeah, there are some solutions for that. There is an SDC, or it might have been the precursor to SDCs, but a Storybook add-on that I believe does that. But the problem in a lot of cases is Twig. It's got to be Twig somehow at the end of the day. So that potentially is the challenge.
So yeah, if the design system offers the output options in what it does externally, and they handle ensuring that that project has all the template files necessary for the disparate projects that could use it, Twig and React, whatever. If that exists, how do you then suck it in? But you're saying Storybook?
So I mean, really what it would be is you would need a build process that, if those are dependencies that you can use wholesale, that adds that dependency to your theme, or there would be a process that would essentially convert those components to the single directory component format. So again, it just needs to be a YAML file that has a schema, and then your assets all with the right names. So it might be massaging it a little bit so that it has the right names.
Couldn't you use the components module? Components module will define namespaces for all of your Twig files wherever you put them. And then
I don't think you need to, though.
Okay.
Yeah, but you could.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the namespaces
Yeah.
in, sorry.
I'm going to stop the recording.